The night I opened my door to a stranger, I thought I was saving one man from the cold. I had no idea I was inviting destiny inside. The snow had been falling for hours. Thick, relentless. The kind of storm that erased roads, buried mailboxes, and convinced sensible people to stay indoors. My cabin sat alone at the edge of town, nearly 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. Normally, I love the quiet. That night, the silence felt different. The wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the old wooden walls groan. I wrapped my sweater tighter around myself and added another log to the fireplace. Orange light danced across the room. Outside, the world had disappeared beneath layers of white. I remember looking at the clock. It was 10:17 p.m. I was about to make a cup of tea when I noticed something through the window. At first, I thought it was a tree branch moving in the storm. Then it moved again. My stomach tightened. Nobody should have been outside in weather like this. I stepped closer to the glass. The snow distorted everything. For a moment, I could barely make out a shape. Then lightning flashed somewhere beyond the mountains. Just for a second, the darkness lit up, and I saw him. A man, alone, stumbling through the storm. My first instinct was disbelief. My second was fear. I lived by myself. Every safety lesson I had ever learned told me not to open the door. Not at night. Not for strangers. Especially not in the middle of nowhere. Yet something about the way he moved stopped me. He was not approaching with purpose. He was barely moving at all. One step, then another, then a stumble. I watched him disappear behind a curtain of snow. A few seconds later, he did not reappear. My heart started racing. I grabbed my coat and flashlight. The moment I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a wall. Snow whipped across my face. The wind howled through the trees. I could barely see 20 feet ahead. "Hello," I shouted. My voice vanished into the storm. No answer. I moved forward carefully. The snow already reached halfway up my boots. Then the flashlight beam caught something dark against the white ground. There he was. The man had collapsed beside a drift near the edge of my property. I hurried toward him. Up close, he looked even worse. Snow covered his shoulders. Ice clung to his dark jacket. His breathing was shallow. His eyes were closed. For one terrifying second, I thought he was unconscious. Then he opened his eyes slightly. Gray eyes. Sharp even through exhaustion. He looked at me, but seemed unable to focus. "Can you hear me?" I asked. He gave the smallest nod. Relief flooded through me. "You need help." His lips moved. I leaned closer. "What?" The wind stole most of his words. I only caught two. "Keep walking." Then he tried to stand and nearly fell again. Even then, he seemed determined not to accept help. I noticed something strange as I grabbed his arm. The watch on his wrist reflected my flashlight. It was elegant. Expensive. The kind of watch I had only seen in magazines. It probably cost more than my entire cabin. Nothing about him made sense. Not the watch. Not the tailored coat beneath the snow. Not the quiet authority in his voice. Yet none of those things mattered. Right then, he was simply a man freezing in a storm. Together, we struggled through the snow toward my cabin. Every step felt harder than the last. The wind pushed against us. The darkness swallowed the path behind us. Finally, the warm glow from my windows appeared ahead. When we reached the porch, he glanced at the light as though he had not expected to see it again. I opened the door. Warm air rushed out into the night. For the first time, I saw genuine relief cross his face. And that was the moment everything changed. The moment we stepped inside, the storm seemed to disappear behind us. The cabin filled with the crackling sound of the fireplace and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Warm air wrapped around us like a blanket. The stranger stood just inside the doorway for a second, breathing heavily as melted snow dripped from his coat onto the wooden floor. Up close, he looked older than I had first thought. Late 30s, maybe. Tall, broad shoulders, dark hair dusted with snow. His skin had lost most of its color from the cold. I quickly shut the door and locked it against the storm. "Sit down before you fall down," I said. For a moment, I thought he might argue. Something in his expression suggested he was not used to taking instructions from anyone. Then his knees nearly gave out beneath him. That settled the debate. He lowered himself into a chair near the fireplace. The orange glow illuminated details I had missed outside. His clothes were expensive. Not flashy, just the kind of quality that spoke quietly. Even his boots looked like they belonged in a luxury store rather than on a mountain road during a blizzard. None of it explained why he had been walking alone through a storm. "I am getting towels," I said. He nodded once. His eyes never stopped scanning the room. Windows, doors, corners. It reminded me of someone entering unfamiliar territory, someone who had learned to pay attention. When I returned, I handed him a towel. Thanks. It was the first full word I had heard him say. His voice was deep and rough from the cold. I pointed toward the fireplace. You should take off that coat before it freezes solid. He managed a faint smile. That bad? Trust me. Slowly, he removed the heavy coat. Underneath, he wore a black shirt that revealed parts of intricate tattoos winding up his neck and disappearing beneath the fabric. More dark ink covered his hands. I blinked in surprise. The tattoos looked expensive, detailed, almost artistic. They contrasted sharply with his otherwise polished appearance. He noticed me looking. Something wrong? No. I quickly looked away. Just unexpected. Another small smile appeared, then vanished. I moved into the kitchen and opened my refrigerator. The contents were not impressive. A container of soup, half a loaf of bread, some eggs. Enough for one person. Maybe two if I stretched it. I glanced toward the living room. The stranger sat staring into the fire. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him now that he was no longer fighting the storm. Without allowing myself time to reconsider, I pulled out the soup. 20 minutes later, the smell of chicken and vegetables filled the cabin. I carried a steaming bowl toward him. Here. He looked genuinely surprised. You did not have to do that. You looked about 10 minutes away from becoming an ice sculpture. He stared at the bowl for a second before accepting it. Still, I sat in the chair across from him with my own smaller portion. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The storm continued outside. The fireplace crackled softly between us. Eventually, he set down the spoon. Why did you stop? I asked. What? The soup. He looked down. It is good. Then eat. Something about that seemed to amuse him. He obeyed. As the warmth returned to his face, I realized I still knew absolutely nothing about him. No name. No explanation. No story. Yet somehow I was no longer afraid. The stranger sitting across from me looked less like a mystery and more like a man carrying a burden too heavy to set down. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, for the first time that night, he finally looked safe. The storm grew stronger as the night deepened. Snow tapped against the windows in endless waves, and the wind circled the cabin like a restless visitor searching for a way inside. I should have gone to bed. Instead, I found myself sitting across from the stranger, watching the firelight flicker across his face. The warmth had returned to his skin, but exhaustion still lingered in his eyes. He looked like someone who had not slept properly in a very long time. The kitchen clock crept past midnight. Neither of us seemed eager to end the conversation. Do you always rescue strangers during blizzards? He asked suddenly. I laughed softly. No, you are my first. A faint smile appeared. Good. I would hate to find out this happens every week. His sense of humor surprised me. There was something guarded about him, but beneath it I could see glimpses of a different person. Someone lighter. Someone who rarely had the chance to relax. I wrapped my hands around a mug of tea. So what were you doing out there? For the first time, his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Traveling. In the middle of a storm? The storm arrived sooner than expected. The answer sounded carefully chosen. Not exactly a lie. Not exactly the truth. I decided not to push. Everyone carried secrets. Mine were simply less expensive. We sat quietly for a while. The fire crackled between us. Shadows moved across the walls. Outside, the snow continued falling without mercy. Eventually, his gaze drifted toward the bookshelf beside the fireplace. You read a lot. I glanced at the shelves and smiled. Occupational hazard. What do you do? I work at the town library. Something about that answer seemed to interest him. You like it? I love it. Why? The question felt genuine. I thought for a moment. Because stories remind people they are not alone. He stared into the flames. That is a good answer. The room fell quiet again. A few minutes later, I noticed his eyes closing briefly before reopening. The exhaustion was catching up with him. You need sleep? I said. I am fine. You almost froze outside. I am still fine. You are terrible at accepting help. That earned another small smile. I have been told that before. I stood and grabbed an extra blanket from the closet. The couch folds out. His eyes followed me. You are letting me stay? The roads are buried under 2 feet of snow. Unless you plan on hiking through the mountains again. He looked toward the window where snow still swirled beyond the glass. Fair point. Together we prepared the sofa bed. The entire situation felt strangely normal despite being anything but normal. Before long, the blankets were arranged and the fire burned low. He stood beside the couch, looking at the room as though memorizing it. Thank you, Grace. I blinked. I do not remember telling you my name. For the first time all evening, he looked caught off guard. Then he nodded toward a framed volunteer certificate hanging on the wall. My name was printed clearly beneath the glass. I laughed. That explains it. I pay attention. Somehow I believed him. I turned toward the hallway leading to my bedroom. Good night. Good night, Grace. I paused before closing my door. The stranger had already settled onto the couch. Firelight danced across the tattoos on his neck and hands. His eyes were closed. For the first time since finding him in the snow, he looked peaceful. I did not know his name. I did not know his story. But as I listened to the storm outside and the quiet cabin inside, I had the strange feeling that meeting him was not an accident. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was pouring through the cabin windows. The storm had finally passed. Fresh snow covered everything outside, transforming the mountains into a landscape of sparkling white. For a few seconds, I forgot about the stranger sleeping in my living room. Then the smell of coffee reached me. I sat up immediately. Coffee. My coffee. I walked down the hallway and stopped at the entrance to the kitchen. He was standing beside the counter, holding a steaming mug. The sight almost made me laugh. Somehow the mysterious man who had nearly frozen to death the night before looked completely at home in my cabin. Good morning, he said. You found the coffee. It was not exactly hidden. His voice sounded stronger. The exhaustion remained, but the color had returned to his face. He looked healthier, more alert, more dangerous, if I was being honest. Not dangerous in a threatening way. Dangerous in the way powerful people sometimes carried themselves without realizing it. I poured myself a cup and glanced toward the window. The snowdrifts looked enormous. You are not leaving today. He followed my gaze. The roads. Completely buried. He nodded as if accepting a business report. Then I suppose I am your guest a little longer. The words felt strangely natural. We spent the morning clearing part of the front porch. Despite his expensive clothes and polished appearance, he never complained. He shoveled snow beside me for nearly an hour. By the time we finished, both of us were laughing at how useless our efforts seemed against the mountains of white surrounding the cabin. Back inside, I prepared a simple breakfast. Scrambled eggs. Toast. The last pieces of fruit from my refrigerator. Nothing special. I placed the plates on the table. He stared at the meal for a moment before sitting down. What? I asked. Nothing. He looked away. I cannot remember the last time someone cooked breakfast for me. I studied him carefully. That sounds lonely. Something unreadable crossed his face. Perhaps. The answer lingered between us. After breakfast, we sat near the fireplace while the winter sun filled the room with soft golden light. It should have felt awkward. Instead, the silence felt comfortable. Eventually, I asked the question that had been bothering me since the night before. Do you have a name? A small smile appeared. Sebastian. Somehow it suited him perfectly. Strong. Controlled. Difficult to forget. Nice to officially meet you, Sebastian. Likewise, Grace. Hearing my name in his voice felt oddly familiar. As the afternoon passed, we talked more. Not about important things. Favorite books. Small towns. Travel. Music. Yet every answer revealed something interesting. Sebastian seemed to know the world far better than most people. He had visited places I had only seen in documentaries. He spoke about cities as if he owned memories in every one of them. Yet whenever the conversation drifted toward his personal life, he carefully redirected it elsewhere. The mystery remained intact. As evening approached, I realized something surprising. I was enjoying his company, far more than I should have. The cabin no longer felt empty. The long winter day no longer felt isolated. For the first time in months, the silence around me felt shared. Outside, the snow reflected the fading sunlight. Inside, Sebastian sat quietly beside the fire, staring into the flames. And although neither of us said it aloud, I had the strange feeling that both of us were dreading the moment the roads finally reopened. The next morning, I woke to silence. Not the comfortable silence that had filled the cabin during the past 2 days. A different silence. Empty. I sat up and immediately noticed something missing. The scent of coffee was gone. The quiet sound of movement from the living room was gone. Even before I left my bedroom, I somehow knew. Sebastian had left. I walked down the hallway and found the sofa neatly folded back into place. The blanket was folded with surprising precision. The fireplace had burned down to glowing embers. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring at the room. It looked exactly the same, yet somehow it felt completely different. Then I noticed a piece of paper resting on the kitchen table. My heart skipped. I crossed the room and picked it up. The message was written in clean, confident handwriting. "Thank you for your kindness. You helped a stranger when you had every reason not to. I will never forget that. Sebastian." I read the note twice. Then a third time. That was all. No explanation. No phone number. No last name. Just a thank you and a goodbye. I laughed softly despite the disappointment settling inside me. Of course he would leave like that. Mysterious until the very end. Outside, the snow sparkled beneath the morning sun. The storm had finally broken completely. A county snowplow had already cleared part of the road leading into town. Life was returning to normal, or at least it should have been. The rest of the day felt strangely quiet. I returned books at the library, helped visitors find novels, organized a shipment of new arrivals. I smiled when people spoke to me. I answered questions. I completed every task exactly as I always did. Yet my thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin, to a man with gray eyes and tattoos hidden beneath expensive clothes, to conversations beside the fireplace, to the way he listened when most people only waited for their turn to speak. By evening, I almost convinced myself I had imagined the entire experience. Maybe Sebastian would become one of those unusual stories people tell years later. The stranger in the snow, the unexpected guest, a brief crossing of paths that changed nothing. That was what I told myself as I drove home. The winter sky had already darkened by the time I reached the cabin. I made soup, fed the birds outside my kitchen window, read a few chapters of a novel. Eventually, I climbed into bed. Before turning off the lamp, I glanced at the folded note resting on my nightstand. I still could not explain why I kept looking at it. The next morning, a deep rumbling sound pulled me from sleep. At first, I thought another storm had arrived. Then the sound grew louder. Engines. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. I sat upright and listened. The noise continued building until the windows actually vibrated. Confused, I threw on a sweater and hurried toward the front door. The moment I stepped onto the porch, I froze. Every road surrounding my property was filled with black vehicles stretching farther than I could see. Sunlight reflected off hundreds of windshields. Men in dark suits stood beside open doors. The entire valley looked as though an army had arrived overnight. And at the center of it all, parked directly in front of my cabin, was a single black SUV larger than the rest. Its rear door slowly opened. The rear door opened slowly, and for a moment nobody moved. The entire valley seemed frozen in place. Hundreds of black vehicles lined the snow-covered roads. Men in dark suits stood silently beside them. Even the birds that usually gathered near my porch had disappeared. Then a polished black shoe touched the ground. My breath caught. Sebastian stepped out of the SUV. He looked nothing like the man I had found in the storm. Gone was the exhausted traveler wrapped in snow and silence. In his place stood someone entirely different. His dark coat fit perfectly. His posture carried effortless authority. The tattoos on his neck were partially visible above his collar. Every person around him seemed to be watching for the slightest signal. Yet when his eyes found mine, something softened. For a brief second, I saw the man who had sat beside my fireplace drinking coffee. "Grace," he said. The sound of my name somehow carried across the entire scene. I stared at him, then at the endless line of vehicles behind him. What is this? It was the only question my brain could form. A faint smile appeared. An apology. I looked around at what appeared to be half the state parked outside my cabin. "You and I have very different ideas about apologies." That earned a genuine laugh from him. Several of the men nearby looked surprised. Apparently, they were not accustomed to hearing him laugh either. Sebastian walked toward the porch. No one followed. The others remained exactly where they were, waiting, watching, respecting an invisible boundary. When he reached the steps, he stopped. I wanted to come back properly, without pretending to be someone else. I folded my arms. "You never told me who you were." His expression became thoughtful. "No, I did not. That feels like important information." "It is." The winter sunlight reflected off the snow around us. Everything felt unreal, like a scene from someone else's life. "So who are you?" I asked. For the first time, Sebastian hesitated. Then he gave a small nod toward one of the men standing nearby. The man immediately handed him a tablet. Sebastian turned the screen toward me. A news article filled the display. There was a photograph. His photograph. The headline sat beneath it in large letters. I read the first few words and felt my stomach drop. The article described one of the most powerful businessmen in the region, the owner of companies, foundations, real estate developments, and charitable organizations spread across multiple states. The estimated value of his holdings made my head spin. I looked from the screen back to him, then back to the screen again. You are kidding. I am not. That is you. Yes. My mind immediately replayed every conversation we had shared, every meal, every joke, every quiet moment beside the fire. None of it matched the image in front of me. You slept on my couch. He smiled. It was a very comfortable couch. I could not help laughing. The absurdity of the situation finally overwhelmed the shock. Sebastian seemed relieved by my reaction. Most people react differently. How differently? Usually there is more staring. Give me time. Another smile. Then his expression grew serious. Grace, when I left your cabin, I expected to thank you and move on. Instead, I realized something. The valley became quiet again. What? I asked softly. He looked directly into my eyes. You helped me when you believed I had nothing to offer you. Do you know how rare that is? I thought about it for a moment. It should not be rare. Something flickered across his face. Respect. Admiration. Maybe both. Behind him, hundreds of vehicles waited. Around him, wealth and influence surrounded every step. Yet standing there on my small porch, Sebastian somehow looked less impressed by his own power than by a simple act of kindness. And I had a feeling that whatever happened next was going to change both of our lives. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The winter sun hung low above the mountains, casting golden light across the endless line of black vehicles. The scene should have felt intimidating. Instead, my attention remained fixed on Sebastian. The man who had arrived surrounded by power was still the same person who had stood in my kitchen making coffee. That realization mattered more than all the SUVs in the valley. So what happens now? I finally asked. Sebastian glanced toward the convoy before looking back at me. That depends on you. The answer caught me off guard. On me? Yes. He stepped closer to the porch. Most people ask for something at this point. I folded my arms. Such as, a faint smile touched his lips. Money. Favors. Opportunities. Introductions. And what if I do not want any of those things? His eyes softened. That is exactly why I came back. The cold mountain air carried a strange stillness between us. Around us, dozens of men pretended not to listen. They failed miserably. You really brought all of this just to say thank you? I asked. Sebastian looked almost embarrassed. Not entirely. That sounds expensive. It probably was. I laughed despite myself. He seemed pleased by that. Then his expression became more serious. Grace, there is something else I wanted to tell you. The tone of his voice made me pay attention immediately. What is it? He looked toward the mountains for a moment as if searching for the right words. When I was younger, my family had very little. People like to talk about success once it happens. They rarely discuss everything that came before it. I listened quietly. There were winters when my mother worried about paying the heating bill. There were days when strangers helped us. His gaze returned to mine. I never forgot those people. The admission surprised me. The articles I had seen described a powerful businessman. They never mentioned a frightened young man remembering acts of kindness from decades earlier. Then why did you seem so surprised by what happened here? I asked. Sebastian smiled sadly. Because the higher you climb, the rarer kindness becomes. The answer lingered in the air. I realized then that wealth had not protected him from loneliness any more than my small cabin had protected me from it. The circumstances were different. The feeling was the same. A sudden movement near the road caught my attention. Several vehicles were arriving from town. Curious residents had started gathering at a distance. Some stood beside pickup trucks. Others simply stared. News traveled quickly in small communities. Hundreds of luxury SUVs parked outside a librarian's cabin tended to attract attention. Your secret is probably gone, Sebastian said. What secret? The one where you lived a quiet life. I looked toward the growing crowd and laughed. You may have a point. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small envelope. This is for you. I accepted it cautiously. What is it? Open it later. I narrowed my eyes suspiciously. That is exactly what mysterious people say. His smile widened. Trust me. Somehow, despite everything, I did. We stood together for another minute watching sunlight shimmer across the snow. The world felt strangely balanced. The mountains, the silence, the man beside me. Finally, Sebastian drew a slow breath. I should let these people get back to work. He gestured toward the hundreds of waiting vehicles. You mean your entire parade? Something like that. Before turning away, he paused. Grace. Yes. For a brief moment, the confident businessman disappeared. In his place stood the traveler I had found in the storm. Thank you for opening your door. My throat tightened unexpectedly. You are welcome. He nodded once. Then he walked back toward the lead SUV. Engines began starting across the valley. One by one, the vehicles prepared to leave. Yet as I stood there holding the envelope in my hands, I had the unmistakable feeling that this was not the end of the story. It was only the end of the beginning. After the last SUV disappeared beyond the curve of the mountain road, the valley slowly returned to normal. The silence felt almost startling. Only a few tire tracks remained in the snow to prove that hundreds of vehicles had been there at all. I stood on the porch holding the envelope long after Sebastian was gone. Finally, I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. The cream-colored paper looked ordinary. Nothing about it suggested it had come from one of the most powerful men in the country. Eventually, curiosity won. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. Not a check, not a contract, not a business proposal. Just a note. Grace, I know you will probably refuse anything that feels like repayment. That is one of the reasons I respect you. Inside this envelope is only an invitation. No obligation. No expectations. If you ever wish to see the library project we are funding in the city, I would be honored to show you. If not, I will still remain grateful. Sebastian. I read the message twice. Then a third time. Relief washed over me. Part of me had worried the envelope might contain something impossible to accept. Instead, it contained a choice. Days passed. Then weeks. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the mountains. The snow melted from rooftops. Streams flowed again. Life settled back into familiar routines. Yet something had changed. Every few days, a package arrived at the library. New books, children's reading programs, educational materials. Each donation came through a foundation. None carried Sebastian's name directly, but I recognized the pattern. He was helping without asking for recognition. One afternoon, nearly a month after the convoy had appeared, my phone rang. I almost ignored it because I was organizing returned books. Almost. Hello. A familiar voice answered. Grace. I smiled before I could stop myself. You remembered how phones work. A quiet laugh came through the line. Barely. Hearing his voice again felt surprisingly natural. We talked for nearly 20 minutes. About books. About work. About nothing important and everything important at the same time. When the conversation ended, I realized I was smiling. The calls continued after that. Sometimes once a week. Sometimes more. Gradually, the distance between our worlds seemed smaller. Then one Friday afternoon, another surprise arrived. A black SUV stopped outside the library. My coworkers nearly dropped what they were doing when Sebastian walked through the front doors. He wore a dark coat and carried the same calm confidence I remembered. Yet his attention searched only for one person. Me. You came all this way for a library tour? I asked. I was told the guide is exceptional. Several employees suddenly found reasons to linger nearby. Sebastian noticed and appeared amused. I spent the next hour showing him every corner of the building. Children's sections, community rooms, reading spaces. He listened to every explanation with genuine interest. By the end of the tour, I realized something unexpected. He looked happier than he had during our first meeting. Lighter, less burdened. As we stood near the front entrance, watching sunlight spill across the parking lot, Sebastian turned toward me. The invitation still stands. The city library project? He nodded. Come see it. I hesitated. Not because I wanted to refuse. Because I knew saying yes would change something. The lines separating our lives would disappear completely. Sebastian seemed to understand the conflict without me saying a word. No pressure, he said softly. Just an invitation. I looked at him. The powerful businessman. The stranger from the storm. The man who still carried gratitude in a world where most people carried expectations. Then I smiled. All right. For the first time since meeting him, Genuine excitement appeared in his eyes. And in that moment, I had a feeling the journey ahead would be far more important than the unlikely way we had first met. The city looked completely different from the mountains. Glass towers reflected sunlight across endless streets. Traffic flowed in every direction. People hurried between meetings, restaurants, and office buildings. Yet as Sebastian's vehicle moved through downtown, something became immediately obvious. People recognized him. They greeted him. They stepped aside respectfully when he passed. The influence I had only read about suddenly became real. Still, what impressed me most was not the attention he received. It was how little he seemed to care about it. His focus remained on the project. The new library stood near the center of the city. Construction was nearly complete. Large windows filled the building with natural light. Reading spaces stretched across multiple floors. Children's areas, community classrooms, technology centers, and study rooms occupied every corner. As I walked through the entrance, I stopped completely. Sebastian, my voice barely worked. This is incredible. He watched my reaction carefully. You like it? I laughed softly. Like it? This place is going to change lives. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The empty building echoed with distant sounds from workers completing final details. Sunlight poured through the glass walls. Bookshelves waited to be filled. Future memories already seemed to live inside the space. That was the goal, Sebastian said quietly. We spent the afternoon touring every floor. He listened while I suggested reading programs and community events. He asked questions, took notes, made adjustments. By the end of the visit, I realized something surprising. Despite everything he had built, Sebastian still valued honest opinions, especially from people who expected nothing from him. Weeks later, the library officially opened. Thousands of visitors attended. Families filled the hallways. Children explored every room. Volunteers helped organize events. Reporters covered the celebration. Yet the moment I remember most happened near sunset. The crowd had begun thinning. Golden light streamed through the windows. Sebastian and I stood on the upper level overlooking the main reading hall. Below us, children sat on colorful rugs listening to stories. Teenagers studied at long tables. Elderly visitors browsed shelves. The building felt alive. You know, Sebastian said, resting his hands on the railing. Everyone keeps congratulating me today. I smiled. You funded it. He shook his head. Money built walls. People built everything else. His eyes moved toward the families below, including you. I looked away for a second, unexpectedly emotional. I only gave suggestions. You gave perspective. His voice remained calm. There is a difference. Silence settled comfortably between us, the kind that no longer needed to be filled. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. What is that? I asked. A familiar smile appeared. Another note. I laughed immediately. You really like notes. They seem to work. I accepted it and unfolded the paper. The message was short. Thank you for opening your door. Not just that night. Every day after. I stared at the words for several seconds. Then I looked up. Sebastian was watching me with the same quiet sincerity I had seen beside the fireplace months earlier. Not the businessman. Not the public figure. Just the man who had once arrived at my cabin covered in snow. You know, I said softly. Most people would have forgotten that night by now. His expression never changed. Grace, power brought many things into my life. He glanced across the crowded library. But kindness changed it. The sounds of laughter drifted upward from below. Somewhere a child turned a page. Somewhere a family began a new memory. Standing there beside him, I finally understood why fate had placed a stranger in a snowstorm outside my door. It was never about wealth. It was never about influence. It was about two lonely people discovering that the smallest act of compassion can echo farther than anyone imagines. The city respected his success, but what I remembered most was something much simpler. On the coldest night of winter, one man found shelter. And in the months that followed, both of us found something far warmer than that.